Let's just start with the first 5 verses, which are really kind of the opening unit in this text, in this passage. And let's catch the logic of what's said here. Start with verses 1 and 2, which say, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, and in whose spirit is no deceit." Now, the word blessed means something like happy, and I think if you just spend some time looking at what these words say, you'll just realize that, to be in a state of forgiveness, when you've done something, that's great. It's blessed. It's a very happy condition, and that's what David, he's gone through this. He's experienced it himself. He felt the weight of all his sin on him, and when he sensed the forgiveness of God, even despite the extreme wickedness of what he did, he just realized, oh man, to be forgiven, it's great. It's wonderful. And I'm just going to do this. I'm going to kind of just put on the screen here kind of the summary of what we're taking away as we're meditating on these verses. And so the first thing I've just put here, to be forgiven is great. It's blessed. It's a very happy condition. I think that's what David is getting across. Now, in the next 3 verses, 3, 4, and 5, what David does is he explains how to attain this happy state. So, how does this happen? And he starts out with a negative example. He says, when I kept silent, in other words, when I didn't run to God, when I stuffed it, when I held it in, went through guilt or shame, I didn't want to acknowledge that I'd ever done any of this. He says, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. Then he says, for day and night, your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. What he's saying is something like this, that when he kept silent, when he was in the process of covering it up, when he wouldn't admit to himself or others that he was a sinner or had committed this sin, he still had something, how our conscience works, where you feel accused, you feel beat down, and he describes it as though his bones, even his bones, were wasting away. He's saying there's something unhealthy about trying to hold on to this. And anyway, that's his negative example. And then the verse 5, he puts it more positively. He says, then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. So, it's kind of by way of contrast when he just kept it in. When he was silent about it, he was in agony. He felt like he was even physically ill, but when he finally acknowledged and confessed it, and he went to the Lord, he found forgiveness there and experienced his blessing. Sometimes when I talk about the psalm with people, I like to call it the taking out the trash psalm. I think what David is saying is something like that. Like if you just store trash in your house, that trash eventually, as it builds up, is going to kill you. It rots, it creates bacteria. You cannot keep it in there. You've got to take out the trash. I think what David is saying is like, look, as long as you keep that guilt, that shame, that fear of being found out inside of you, maybe at first you'll think it's good. But over the course of time, the way our conscience works and just the way we're wired, that'll become like a disease that starts to rot you from the inside out. And I think what David is saying is you've got to take out the trash. I don't know. I kind of debated saying this, whether or not to say it, but I'll just go ahead with it. I think it's also like sickness. You know what I mean? You get sick and you feel like, okay, I know I got to vomit, but you try not to. And the longer you try not to, the worse and worse and worse you feel. You're just stuffing it and trying to keep it in. And then finally, you let it out, and the relief you feel. I don't know if I'm sorry, that's sort of a disgusting example. But I think that's what David is saying. It's like, when I kept it in, I was sick. It was killing me. It was terrible. But then I acknowledged it. And wow, what a relief, how blessed, how happy. I mean, I received forgiveness. And I mean, to be forgiven is a blessed state. And so here, I'll just put this number 2. How to attain this happy state. What David is saying is, don't conceal and hide it. He's like, I tried that. That doesn't work. It makes you miserable. Instead, acknowledge it. Confess it. You know, if you think about the entire Bible, oftentimes I like to say this, the entire Bible has a message of good news. The gospel of Jesus Christ, that's the story of the Bible. And, often I like to summarize that story with just 3 words: sin, salvation, service. And one of the reasons I like to summarize it that way is there's no person who ever comes to salvation who does not acknowledge their sin. One of the things that is absolutely necessary of every Christian is at some point you have to acknowledge before God that you're a sinner, that you can't stand in his presence because of how good you are, your good works, or your inherent worth, but you only throw yourself on the mercy of the court, so to speak. You depend upon the grace of God, and there's no one who's ever become a Christian who doesn't do exactly what David is instructing people to do here. They get it out. They take out the trash. They finally, instead of stuffing it, come out and say, look, I'm humbling myself. I'm acknowledging who I am and what I've done, and I confess that before you. And when that happens and we acknowledge our sin, then we find salvation. And that's, I think, what David is saying, verses 1 through 5. Now I want to continue because it's even better than that. I mean, what David says here next, I think, is so great. In verse 6, he says, therefore, let all the faithful pray to you while you may be found. So I think he is reflecting on his own experience, but then he drives out an inference or conclusion. He's like, look, since this is the case, I mean, anyone who's listening, anyone who can learn from my experience, don't just sit back there and keep it stuffed in and continue to feel miserable and the hurt and pain of the whole thing. Like, if you're alive and you're listening, then draw near to God and pray and acknowledge and confess your sin. And here's what you're going to find, the same thing I did: forgiveness. And so I think he says one of the benefits here of prayer is just that, forgiveness. When you draw near to God, you're not going to find an ogre who's going to hold it over your head. Instead, you're going to find what David found, a loving God who wants to forgive. And so he's telling everybody, look, if you're listening to me, if you can understand anything I'm saying, then don't run away from God. Often that's what we do. It says run toward God in prayer. In the middle of verse 6, he says, surely the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. But I spent a lot of time thinking about these 2 verses, and I think this is wonderful. You know, here's what David's saying. He's saying, look, when I went to God and I confessed my sins, not only did I find out that he wasn't against me, but I also found out that he was for me. In other words, not only did I find out that he was willing to forgive my sin, he wasn't against me, but then what I found out is that he wanted to protect me. He wanted to love me. He wanted to shelter me. He was for me. And man, these promises, the rising of the mighty waters will not reach them. In other words, whatever threat comes your way, God is going to shield you from it. And he says this, you are my hiding place. You'll protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance. I just love that. You'll surround me with songs of deliverance. What's he saying? He's saying, like, your protection is going to be so obvious and so evident. Like right now, I might be feeling pain and guilt because I haven't come to you. But if you go to him, not only are you going to find that he's going to forgive you, but then on top of that, what you're going to find is that you're going to be embraced by him in such a way that over and over and over again, you're going to find yourself laughing and singing and like, I can't believe how good God's been to me. Listen, I mean, if you get who God is and what he's done for you, you won't be able to help but have a smile on your face, because this is what I did against him. And not only did he not punish me for it, but he's blessing me like this. And everyone who tries to come against me, he protects. I mean, there will be like a permanent song in your heart, a permanent smile on your face. I think that's the second thing that is being promised. Instead of running from God, you run toward him, you get forgiveness. And then I think number 2, protection. And then verse 8, I think, is really interesting. It's almost like the way David writes this psalm. It's no longer he who's writing, but it's like God breaks in. Like, okay, David, you said it, I want to say something. And God breaks in and he says this: I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I'll counsel you with my loving eye on you. This is so fantastic. I think most of us want this, right? We want some guidance. You know, we find in life like, oh, where do I go? Or what should be my next step? And often we think to ourselves like, okay, I got these two. I don't know which is better, and I don't know what the better outcome is. And it's like God breaks in and he says, when you come to me and you receive forgiveness and you become my child, not only am I going to protect you and wrap my arms around you so that there's going to be songs of deliverance surrounding you, but then on top of that, I'm going to whisper in your ear. I'm going to let you know how to live. I'm going to guide you to the left or to the right. And at any moment when you find yourself like afraid or you don't know what to do, I'm going to counsel you. I'm going to guide you. I'm going to be there with you. My loving eye is going to be on you. And so I think that's maybe the third thing. You know, oftentimes when we feel guilty, we think, okay, I better stay away from God. But God is saying, no. Run to me, and here's what you find. You'll find forgiveness. You'll find my protection, and you'll see that I begin to guide and counsel you in life so that from here on out, everything just gets better and better. It's like, you know, it's going to spiral upwards if instead of what your impulse is to stay away from me, you'll come toward me. Okay, I don't know if you noticed this, but, you know, I entitled this sermon, Forgiveness, Don't Be Like a Horse. And this verse is the reason why. Verse 9. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. So this is now the second time there's an instruction. The first time is in verse 6. You know, David said, okay, all the faithful people, if you're listening to me, like, pray to God. I think this verse is the reverse. I mean, it's like the flip side of the same coin. He says, don't be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding, but must be controlled by the bit and bridle. They'll not come to you. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I haven't spent a lot of times around horse or mule, so it took me a little while to figure out, okay, what is this verse saying? Why shouldn't I be like a horse? But finally, I don't know if you're like me. I'm a little bit more concrete. I like images and pictures. And so finally, I was able to work this through in my mind. I think what David is doing here is he's thinking of like a farm. And there's animals on the farm. Now, on this farm, there are some animals that apparently, you know, you can give them a name. You can call to them, and they'll just start following you. So sheep are like that. Actually, I don't know if you know this, but I was reading in John 15, Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, and he says that he knows each sheep by name, and that when they sleep at night, they sleep in a pen, but when the shepherd comes, he calls out to each one by name, and they come out of the pen and they start following him. And that's actually a picture of salvation. Jesus knows each one of us. And for those of us who are his people, here's what happens. At some point, you're going to hear God calling out to you. I think everyone who's become a Christian, they've in some way or another heard the call of God. You know, it's not just that you showed up in church and you heard someone talking and you thought, boy, that's interesting. It'll be that, and I think everyone who's ever become a Christian, it's like, beyond that, in some way or another, you'll hear God himself as though he reaches down from heaven and he knows you. And he says, you're mine, come to me. And you hear that voice. Anyway, that's a digression. I'm just trying to talk about how on a farm, there are apparently some animals that you can give a name and then you just call and they'll come. Since we don't know very much about farms, most of us, I just thought in terms of maybe we know this, right? Like we have Oliver, or we have Copper, or we have Buzz, or whatever your dog's name is, and you just say, "Here, girl," and they don't just stand there and be like, "What do you want?" Like, okay, They go quickly. Here, I found this picture. Here, what you're supposed to do when I put this picture up is just say, Right? There are these animals that when you give them a name and you call to them, they don't just stand off stubbornly. They come. But I think what David is saying here is he says, don't be like a horse or a mule. Well, what's a mule like? Well, I think this is their characteristics. They're stubborn and stupid. Okay? So I found this picture. I don't know which one they are first, stupid or stubborn and stupid, but they have both traits. And it's like, okay, the farmer's built this wonderful barn, a shelter for his animals whenever they're running into trouble. And like there's a hailstorm coming, so the farmer's like, "Hey, Oliver," and the dogs come and the sheep come. And then he calls out to the mule, and the mule's like, "I ain't going anywhere." The farmer's like, "Come on, there's hail coming, you're gonna get destroyed." The mule's like, "I'm standing right here." So what the farmer has to do is he has to run out, he has to bring a bridle and a bit and put it in the donkey's mouth, and only by using the pain of the bridle and the bit does he finally get this stubborn donkey to come along. And what David is saying, he's like, be more like Oliver, Copper, and Buzz. When you hear God calling, like, come, it's gonna be good. You're gonna be out of the hail. Don't be like this mule. Because what's gonna happen is there's gonna be pain that's gonna come your way. Now, I, didn't know even so much about horses and mules and bits and bridles. So here, this picture, just so you can kind of figure out how those of you who are like me and you're not horse people, the only time I was really around a horse is I was on my honeymoon. We were in Mexico. And I wasn't trying to ride the horse. I just walked past him, and he reached out and tried to bite me. And I'm like, I'm done with horses. So, that's all I know. But here, I took time to figure this out. What does a bridle and what does a bit do? And I found this great picture. What happens is they put a bit in a horse's mouth, and it's a metal piece which is uncomfortable, and it goes over the soft tissue of their tongue and their lips, so that they will take instruction from you. A horse, they're not like dogs. They don't just, "Hey, come here, jump, sit down, roll over." You can tell the horse to roll over as many times as you want. They're not going to do it. But what ends up happening is you got to ride a horse, and so they'll put a bit in its mouth, and then it'll be the pain of that metal piece on the soft tissue. And I guess even I was reading about this, some horses need a bit that causes more pain, and some horses get by with just a little pain. And anyway, what is David saying when he's saying, don't be like a horse or the mule, which have no understanding and must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you? I think here probably is what he's saying. That for every sin there is, God just made it this way. He's made it this way for our benefit. Doesn't often feel this way. He's made it this way for our benefit. That there are built-in consequences to the wrong things we do. Now, sometimes those built-in consequences are very immediate and obvious, and they hurt and cause pain. Sometimes they're not immediate and obvious. In fact, it builds up over time. And because we keep doing them, eventually it brings that pain. Now, if you read, as an example, in Genesis chapter 3, which describes the first sin and its consequences, you'll find out that human beings, after they fell into sin, they were filled with pride. They said, "I don't need God. I'm fine on my own." They were filled with guilt. You know, when you feel guilty, what do you want to do? I mean, when you've done something against another person, you want to avoid that person, not be around them. And so in our hearts, we want to avoid God and not be around him. Human beings are filled with shame, which means that we kind of put on a face, we cover up, we hide, and we say, oh, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong. When all the time there is something wrong and hurting in our heart. And that pride, that guilt, that shame, it makes us turn to God and say, hey, I don't need you. I'm totally fine. There's nothing wrong. I'm fine. And by the way, I'm out of here. And I think most people know what this is like. You know, you've sinned against God and you just think to yourself, well, I got to avoid him. Because when we sin against other people, we think, I got to avoid him. And there's lots and lots of people who all their life, they spend time avoiding God. And they fall further and further away from him. But what ends up happening, the more you avoid God, the more you spend time avoiding him, is that the consequences of avoiding God and falling into sin start to catch up with you. Now, how do they catch up with you? They catch up with you in the form of pain. And that pain begins to mount, and people often talk about this, until they hit rock bottom. And you know, when you hit rock bottom, you have no other choice but to look up. And that's God's purpose. He introduces pain into our life so that finally we, not like the horse and the mule, which just stand there stubbornly and stupidly, but eventually that pain, causes us to turn back to him. And we realize, I can't make it on my own, and I do need God, and help. That's what people say. Now, I've talked this over with a lot of people, and I don't know any other way to describe it. I've just observed this, that some of us have what I call a low pain tolerance, and others of us have what I call a high pain tolerance. Why is that? I don't know. Here's how it works, though. There's one person, and they've fallen into sin, and they experience the consequences of sin, but the pain is just slight, like God flicked their ear a little bit, like, hey, you can't live without me. And they're like, oh, that hurt. Okay, God, I need you. And they just quickly, with almost no pain at all, run to God. And they experience his forgiveness, and they're like, okay, I'm happy and I'm blessed, and this forgiveness is awesome, and he surrounds me with his protection and songs of deliverance, and he instructs me, and that's it. That's all it takes, just a little pain. They admit they're a sinner, and they need God. Then there's others of us, and I know some of us are here today who fit into this category. You sin, and that sin causes pain. Boom, upside the head. And you're like, that didn't hurt. Right? And so, you only hit rock bottom when you hit rock bottom, and because you persist in that sin, boom, again, it didn't hurt, I'm fine. And, I don't know why, but there are some people who, their rock bottom is way down there. And where is your rock bottom? Your rock bottom is when you finally decide you've had enough and you look up. And anyway, I think this is the point of what David's saying. He's like, look, you stubborn people, haven't you had enough pain? Don't be like that. Just be more like the dog who just runs to God. Don't you realize he's going to forgive you? He's going to protect you. He's going to bring you in the barn. He's going to guide you. He's going to, don't stand out there in the hail and keep getting beat up. Just come. I think that's what verse 9 is saying. In fact, I think it's such an important message. Anyway, now we're on verses 10 and 11. Are you still with me? It says, many are the woes of the wicked, but the Lord's unfailing love surrounds the one who trusts in him. Rejoice in the Lord and be glad, you righteous. Sing, all you who are upright in heart. I love how the psalm ends just reflecting on God's unfailing love and telling us to rejoice and sing. Because ultimately, I think the psalm, if you take it from David's perspective, it's just like, it's a statement about the greatness of God. How fantastic and wonderful he is. And, the whole psalm, I think, is about forgiveness. We've been talking about that. I'd like to put my finger on who God is. So let's talk a little bit about the nature of forgiveness. I like these stick figures, so I'm back. Here we go. Let's just suppose that you own a bicycle. Here's what I'm going to be getting at. That forgiveness always entails a cost. So let's just say you have this bicycle, and then you have this friend who shows up and says, hey, will you lend me your bike? You're like, oh, yeah, sure, here, take my bike. And let's say that their friend doesn't appreciate your property the same way you do, and so they go up, and as they're riding your bike around, they just beat it up, and they smash it. I mean, they just don't even care. And then they return the bike, and they're like, hey, I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? And now here, forgiveness always entails cost. Here's what you can do. You can either say, no, you owe me, and you can exact the penalty from them, right? Like, you ruined my bike, you pay for my bike. And if you do, then the person's not forgiven, and they owe the debt, right? You can exact the penalty for them. But if you do forgive them, don't think there's not a price. If you forgive them and say, you know what, I do forgive you, and that person walks away, and you've got a broken bike, like, who bore the cost? Of course you did, right? Like, you spent money on this bike, and if you want a bike again, you're going to have to spend more money. So here's the deal with forgiveness. There's always a cost. And when you face someone that needs forgiveness, either they can pay the price or you'll pay the price. Here's what David is saying about God. He's saying, run to him. This is a God who loves us so much that he's not going to rub our nose in it and make us pay. He is actually going to do something else. He's going to pay. And I just love that David, he experienced this in the Old Testament. I told you this is 1,000 years before the coming of Jesus. And he's like, I have discovered who God is. In the midst of my sin and coming to him and acknowledging who he is, I have discovered who he is. He's this great God that if you come to him, he's not going to make you pay. He'll pay the price. He'll cover the cost. Verse 1, blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. What's he saying? He's saying, the one who has their sins forgiven, God covers the price. And of course, as a Christian, you can't help but look at the cross and see what this is all about. Because we're all sinners. And there's consequences and there's justice. And either we face the justice, we face the consequences, or God's going to do it. And here's what the gospel is all about, that God came down, he entered our world, took out our flesh, and he paid the price. He bore the cost. The punishment, the debt that we owed was put on him, and he took it in our place. And what's David saying? He's saying, okay, so everybody, don't be like a horse. Some of you, you'll hear this, and you might even, you feel your metaphorical legs like strengthening, like, oh, this God stuff. No, don't be like that. If you come to him, you're going to experience a sense of blessedness, happiness. He's going to forgive you. You're going to sense his protection in your life. You're going to sense his guiding. Everything is going to be changed. And so don't be like a horse. Those who hear what's being said here, just come to God. Just come to God. So I'd like to end in prayer. We've been reflecting on the psalm together. I think this is the case. In fact, I know it's the case. That for so many of us, God spoke in different ways. I know in a room this size, there's every different kind of hurt and pain that people are experiencing right now. There's every different kind of sin that people are covering up right now. You think that it's hidden, you think that it's tucked away, you think it's never going to come out, and it's causing a sickness. You've got to get it out. And so I'd like to just pray for everyone. And I'd like to pray that we don't have any mules here. That this will be a moment where we just listen to what God says and we just offer ourselves to him quickly and right away. So let's pray together. Thanks so much for viewing this sermon. I hope you enjoyed it. For more content like this, please subscribe below, and I'll see you next time.